You're listening to Coaching Cues podcast, where experts all around the world answer your most burning questions surrounding the wide topic of strength training. Every week we tackle the what, the why, and the how of one specific topic in just 15 minutes. Straight to the point, no fluff. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this week's episode.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name is Greg Potter, and today I'm speaking about how nutrition affects circadian rhythms. This topic falls under the umbrella of what scientists call chrononutrition. And chrononutrition is the relationship between what you eat and your body's clock. This clock programs daily rhythms in all sorts of processes in your body, including your sleep-wake cycle, digestion, metabolism, and immune function. And chrononutrition has a couple of important implications. First, what and when you eat influence the function of your body's clock. And second, because your clock optimizes your body for specific processes at certain times of day, you can use an understanding of your body's clock to optimize your diet and thereby improve your health, performance, and physique. But before we dive in, the reason I'm here is that my Ph.D. focused on the interactions between sleep, circadian rhythms, nutrition, and metabolic health. I've done lots of coaching over the years too, including everyone from elite sprinters to ultra-endurance athletes to people with chronic health conditions. I also do some consultancy, both with individuals and large companies. And finally, I'm co-founder and chief science officer at resilientnutrition.com, a nutrition and supplement company that aims to make feeling and performing better easier and tastier. Now, to get into circadian rhythms, in case you're not very familiar with them, let's begin with what they are and why we have them. If we think about this through the lens of evolution, then life on Earth evolved in the presence of predictable environmental cycles, and the most prominent of these was the light-dark cycle. In response, organisms evolved their own biological clocks to help them anticipate and adapt to environmental cycles in light and temperature and food availability. And these biological clocks set the daily schedule of when it's best for our bodies to do specific activities, being physically active, fighting pathogens, digesting food, removing byproducts of metabolism, consolidating memories, and so on. And if our bodies try to do all of this all at once, that would take an awful lot of energy. Hence why we compartmentalize the timing of these processes. So our ancestors lived under the influence of two clocks, the environmental clock and the biological one. But then things changed in the blink of an evolutionary eye. Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb in the late 19th century. And electric lighting both disrupted our body's clocks and enabled activities at times when our clocks promoted sleep. Shift work became commonplace, and meanwhile, our ancestors systematically engineered physical activity out of our lives, and nowadays we also have round-the-clock food access, and all these different things conspire to disrupt our body's clocks, and there are many different instances of this, everything from insufficient daytime light exposure to excessive nighttime light exposure to flying across different time zones, resulting in jet lag. And so nowadays, a third clock influences our lives more and more, and that is the social clock. The problem, of course, is that these disruptions probably negatively affect all aspects of our biology. But the good news is that you can optimize the function of your biological clock and thereby probably positively affect all aspects of your biology. Now, if we think about how these circadian rhythms are regulated, then they arise from the activity of many so-called clocks in your body. And it's likely that there are individual clocks in every one of the trillions of cells in your body. And these influence the timing of various activities, including building new structures and breaking down damaged ones. And because there are so many of these clocks, they need to be kept in sync with each other. This synchronization process is strongly influenced by a master clock in the brain named the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And a bit like the conductor in an orchestra, it helps keep clocks elsewhere in the body in time by using a range of different synchronizing mechanisms including rhythms in core body temperature, neural signals, and secretion of certain substances too. And the most obvious consequence of the 24-hour changes in the activity of the cells in the master clock is your daily sleep-wake cycle. And importantly, the master clock in your brain is primarily set by your patterns of exposure to light, and specifically light at the level of your eyes. And light is therefore a so-called time cue, the technical term that scientists use is Zeitgeber, that can shift the timing of your body's clockwork. And it primarily does this via its effects on the pineal gland that synthesizes melatonin, the hormone that acts on receptors throughout the body to signal when it's the nighttime and hence to engage in nighttime activities. Now, the light that most effectively sets your master clock is the kind of light that you get outdoors when the sun is up. So high intensity light that contains lots of short wavelengths. And if you get more of this kind of light within about 2 hours of waking up, you'll tend to shift your clock earlier, helping you fall asleep earlier. But if you get more of this kind of light within a couple of hours of when you normally go to bed, you'll tend to delay your clock and hence your sleep. But it seems that the clocks outside of the master clock, or so-called peripheral clocks, are reset each day in part by what you eat and when. And this means that regular meal times can help you maintain a robust system of biological clocks. Now, to make this more relevant to you and your training, I'll give some examples of different clock-driven changes in your biology that you can make the most of if you want a better body. So if we start with digestion, then the motility of your digestive tract changes over the course of the day, and the migrating motor complex that pushes indigestible food from the stomach to the small intestine is much faster during the daytime than it is during the nighttime. But circadian rhythms also influence digestion, how well you absorb nutrients, and the electrolyte balance in the GI tract. And then there is, of course, the gut microbiota, the ecosystem of different organisms in your gut. And these vary substantially over the course of the 24-hour day too, with all sorts of consequences. If we move to metabolism, then diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the increase in metabolic rate that's present for several hours after eating, changes over the course of the day. And Frank Shear and Chris Morris from Harvard did some nice work a few years ago showing that you burn about 50% more calories in the 2 hours after eating a meal in the biological morning, so about 8 a.m., than after the very same meal in the biological evening, so about 8 p.m. or so. Thinking about blood sugar control, then these same researchers have shown that your oral glucose tolerance, so how well you tolerate carbohydrate, is about 17% lower in the biological evening than it is in the biological morning. And we know something about why this is the case. So the clock in your gut influences things like glucose absorption, clocks in your muscles and your fat tissue and liver influence insulin sensitivity over the course of the 24-hour day. And the clock in your pancreas influences insulin secretion too. And interestingly, several studies have shown that even when they try to prevent weight loss by giving people additional calories, skipping dinner, so concentrating your food intake early in the day, can improve blood sugar control, fat burning, blood pressure, and also hunger pangs compared to when dinner is included. The issue, of course, is that skipping dinner is not always practical. So an alternative strategy is to keep your meal times fixed as they are now, but to shift the relative size of different meals. And Danielle Jakubovic did some great work on this in 2013. She put two groups of women through a 12-week weight loss program, and one group had half their calories at breakfast, the other had half their calories at dinner. But importantly, the diets contained the same number of calories and the same macronutrient composition. To cut to the chase, the late eating group, who had a larger dinner, lost less than half as much body weight as the early eating group. And they also lost less than half as many inches off their waists. And their improvements in blood sugar and blood lipids weren't as good either. So if you're not training, then the suggestion would be that concentrating a lot of your food intake early in the day is good for your metabolic health. But you have to remember that your training will lead to all sorts of change in your body that will, for example, increase non-insulin mediated glucose uptake in your muscles. And so it makes sense to front load your intakes on non-training days, especially if you're trying to shed fat and improve your blood sugar. But on training days, it's fine to consume more of your food later in the day. And then finally, if we think about protein intake, we want to space that quite evenly, because each time you consume protein, you want enough protein to maximize the synthesis of new proteins in your skeletal muscles. And typically, you probably want a dose of at least 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal to achieve that. And then finally, I'll throw in a bonus tip here, which isn't related to circadian biology, but it is relevant. And that's that if you're trying to improve your blood sugar control and insulin sensitivity, then at meals, you should focus on consuming protein, fiber, and fat-rich foods first. And the reason is that groups of researchers such as Alpana Shukla's group have shown that in people with poor blood sugar regulation, simply saving carb-rich items such as bread for the end of meals can dramatically reduce their blood sugar swings in response to eating those meals. And your body's clock is also relevant to your ability to metabolize drugs, which shouldn't be a surprise based on what I was just saying. There's now a whole field of research named chrono pharmacology that aims to use an understanding of the circadian system to optimize people's use of medications. And well-controlled studies have shown that for some medications, improving the timing of use of these drugs can reduce side effects by as much as 5-fold in some people, and can as much as double the efficacy of drugs. But the results have been quite inconsistent. Interestingly, your meal timing seems to set the time of different clocks throughout your body, probably including the liver, and that could influence drug metabolism too. So as an example of this, there's been research showing that in mice, simply shifting their meal times will change when drugs are most toxic to the liver. And so the implications of this are that when you eat might affect your responses to medications, and you should ask your doctor if there's a best time of day to pop any pills that you get prescribed. If we think about your training now, then your core body temperature oscillates over the course of the day, tends to be lowest late in your sleep period and highest in the late biological afternoon, typically at about 6 p.m. for most people. And we tend to be strongest when our temperature is highest and also most powerful. And that probably explains why most world records tend to be set in the late afternoon or early evening. So if you train once a day and you have the option to train in the afternoon, then you might benefit from scheduling your training then relative to other times of day. And your clocks also affect your sleep too. So as an example, if you spend at least an hour outdoors in sunlight each day, while minimizing exposure to artificial light between a couple of hours before your planned bedtime and when you wake up in the morning, you will be better able to maintain a healthy sleep-wake cycle, and your sleep quality will likely improve too. I want to add a few comments about time-restricted eating, which many of you will have heard of. And definitions of time-restricted eating vary, but the one that I use is restricting consumption of anything that contains calories to 12 hours or less each day. So that might entail only consuming calorie-containing items between, say, 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., for instance. And various studies have shown that this might be helpful. It might be helpful for a few reasons. One is that it can promote strong function of your body's clockwork, and controlled experiments have shown that when diet composition is controlled, having a fixed number of meals each day can increase diet-induced thermogenesis and improve blood sugar control, as well as appetite regulation. But I think there are also indirect effects of time-restricted eating on diet quality. People tend to eat certain foods at certain times of day. Very few people have wine at breakfast, but quite a few have wine late in the day. And very few people have cereal at dinner, but quite a few have it at breakfast. And so when people use time-restricted eating and they consume an earlier dinner and they're less prone to snacking on ice cream and drinking wine in front of the TV, it's likely that the composition of their nutrition is going to get better too. And in terms of the effect of time-restricted eating, a meta-analysis published last year included 19 studies, and the scientists from Korea basically found that time-restricted eating reduced body weight and fat and preserved fat-free mass, so muscle mass and so on. It also reduced systolic blood pressure and improved fasting blood sugar and triglycerides too. And you might be wondering about resistance training. There hasn't been that much research on this, but Grant Tinsley and his colleagues have done several studies now combining different forms of time-restricted eating with lifting weights. And to cut to the chase, they've generally shown that time-restricted eating doesn't really have meaningful effects on gains in the gym, but certainly it can be used to improve body composition. So in terms of recommendations, I think eating windows of anywhere between 4 hours and 10 hours have been shown to be beneficial during fat loss phases, but I would definitely push you towards the upper end of that range, perhaps 8 to 10 hours. And I think it makes sense to have an eating window that's proportional to your energy intake. So if you're trying to gain weight, then you might want a slightly longer window, maybe 12 hours. Whereas if you're deep in a fat loss phase, maybe you only want to have one of 8 hours or so. And that way, each of your individual meals can be larger and therefore more satisfying. I think you should finish your eating window by at least 2 hours before bed if you want to sleep well. And I typically recommend that people wait 3 to 6 hours between meals. One thing that I'll add is that if you're on a very low carb or ketogenic diet, then I think time-restricted eating can be especially helpful. And then finally, certain individual constituents of the diet can affect the clocks in your body, including alcohol, but probably the best recognized of these is caffeine, which not only reduces sleepiness, but it can also shift the timing of the master clock in your brain if you consume it shortly before bedtime. And that will tend to delay sleep and obviously worsen sleep quality too. So as a rule of thumb, while there's massive variation between people and how they metabolize caffeine, limiting your intake to no more than 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight and finishing caffeine no later than 8 hours before bed is likely to help you sleep well at night and avoid disrupting your body's clock. So in closing, it's not only what you eat that matters, when you eat matters too. And by applying the science of chrononutrition, you will likely be able to improve your metabolic health, especially if it's not the best to start with. And positive effects of chrononutrition on your health and body composition could well be meaningful in the long term. If you want more information about chrononutrition and nutrition in general, then do check out my free nutrition ebook, which is available at resilientnutrition.com/principles. I'm also on Instagram at Greg Potter, Ph.D. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you for listening to Coaching Q's podcast. If you would like your question to be answered by an expert, please head to coachingqs.org/ask. See you next week.